The steel-gray waters of the Philippine Sea rippled ominously in the pre-dawn darkness of October 23, 1944, as Admiral Takeo Kurita's massive fleet carved through the waves toward what would become history's largest naval engagement. Aboard the heavy cruiser Otago, Kurita stood on the bridge, his weathered face etched with the weight of Japan's desperate gamble. The Imperial Navy's last operational carriers, battleships, and cruisers were converging on Leyte Gulf in a final, all-or-nothing assault designed to shatter American forces and turn the tide of the Pacific War. 3,000 miles away in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz had already anticipated this moment. Intelligence reports had painted a clear picture of Japanese intentions, and the American commander knew that the fate of the Pacific campaign hung in the balance. The recently launched Operation King II had successfully established American forces on Leyte Island, but the Japanese response would be swift and overwhelming, for separate Japanese naval forces were now steaming toward the Philippines, each representing a different prong of Admiral Somu Toyoda's Show-1 plan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, as Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell prepared for what would become one of the war's most significant aerial reconnaissance missions. His Hellcat Fighter Squadron had been tasked with locating and reporting on Japanese fleet movements, but none of the young aviators could have imagined the massive armada they were about to discover. As McCampbell's aircraft lifted off from the carrier's deck, the stage was set for a confrontation that would involve over 200 ships and nearly 2,000 aircraft. Admiral William Bull Halsey commanded the Third Fleet from his flagship USS New Jersey, his aggressive tactics having already earned him legendary status among American naval forces. Halsey's carriers had been striking Japanese positions throughout the central Philippines, but intercepted communications suggested something far more significant was approaching. The Japanese were committing their entire remaining fleet to a single decisive battle, exactly the kind of engagement that could end the war in the Pacific once and for all. According to detailed accounts from Samuel Eliot Morrison's official U.S. Navy history, the complexity of the approaching battle would test every aspect of American naval doctrine and training. The Japanese plan was audacious in its scope and desperate in its execution. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force, built around the carriers Zuikaku and Zuiho, would serve as a decoy to lure Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the invasion beaches. Meanwhile, Kurita's center force would transit the San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness, strike the vulnerable American transports in Leyte Gulf, and retreat before dawn. A third force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would simultaneously attack through Surigao Strait, creating chaos and confusion among the American defenders. But as October 23 dawned clear and bright, the first phase of the battle was already beginning. American submarines Darter and Dace, patrolling the approaches to the Philippines, detected Kurita's massive fleet as it approached the Palawan Passage. The two submarines positioned themselves for attack, their crews knowing that the success of their mission could determine the outcome of the entire Pacific campaign. The trap was set, and the largest naval battle in human history was about to begin. The thunderous roar of torpedo explosions shattered the pre-dawn calm as USS Darter and USS Dace launched their coordinated attack on Admiral Kurita's center force. At exactly 6:32 in the morning on October 23rd, Commander David McClintock's perfectly aimed torpedoes struck the heavy cruiser Otago, sending Japan's most experienced fleet commander scrambling for his life as his flagship listed heavily to port. Within minutes, the massive warship slipped beneath the dark waters of the Palawan Passage, taking with her over 300 sailors and nearly drowning Kurita himself. The submarine attack sent shockwaves through the Japanese formation, as they simultaneously targeted the heavy cruiser Maya, her torpedoes finding their mark with devastating precision. The explosion was so violent that it lifted the cruiser's bow completely out of the water, before she broke apart and sank in less than 4 minutes. A third heavy cruiser, Takao, limped away with severe damage, her crew fighting desperately to keep her afloat as she retreated toward Brunei Bay. Admiral Kurita, rescued from the oil-slicked waters by the destroyer Kishinami, transferred his flag to the super battleship Yamato and pressed forward with grim determination. The loss of 2 heavy cruisers and his flagship had been a devastating blow, but the larger mission remained unchanged. The center force continued its advance toward the San Bernardino Strait, unaware that American codebreakers had already deciphered their intentions, and Admiral Halsey's carriers were racing to intercept them. The morning of October 24th brought clear skies and perfect flying conditions. As the first waves of American aircraft launched from Task Force 38's carriers, Commander Hugh Winters led 64 aircraft from USS Intrepid and USS Cabot in the opening airstrike against Kurita's fleet, now steaming through the narrow waters of the Sabine Sea. The Japanese formation presented a magnificent and terrible sight. The massive bulk of Yamato and her sister ship Musashi dominated the center, surrounded by heavy cruisers and destroyers in perfect battle formation. The air battle that followed was unlike anything previously seen in the Pacific War. Japanese Zero fighters rose to meet the incoming Americans, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned by the newer Hellcats and Corsairs. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, already an ace with 19 confirmed kills, led his fighter squadron in a sweeping attack that cleared the skies of enemy aircraft. Within 30 minutes, with Japanese air cover eliminated, American dive bombers and torpedo planes pressed their attacks against the heavily armored battleships below. Musashi, the pride of the Imperial Navy and sister ship to the legendary Yamato, became the primary target of successive American airstrikes throughout the day. The super battleship's 18-inch main guns fired defiantly at the attacking aircraft, their massive shells creating towering waterspouts that threatened to bring down any plane flying too low. But the American pilots pressed their attacks with remarkable courage, scoring hit after hit on the massive vessel's armored superstructure. Contemporary reports from war correspondent Ernie Powell, who witnessed the battle from aboard USS Franklin, described the scene as the most magnificent and terrible display of naval warfare ever witnessed by human eyes. By noon, Musashi had absorbed an incredible amount of punishment. 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedo strikes had turned the once mighty battleship into a floating wreck, her decks awash with seawater, her proud pagoda mast tilted at a dangerous angle. Captain Toshihira Inoguchi refused repeated suggestions to abandon ship, instead ordering his crew to continue fighting as long as their guns could bear on the enemy. The final airstrike of the day came at 3:30 in the afternoon, when 40 aircraft from USS Enterprise and USS Franklin delivered the coup de grace. Musashi's magazine exploded in a tremendous fireball that could be seen from 50 miles away, and the super battleship rolled over and sank by the bow, taking with her over 1,000 officers and men. It was the first time in the war that American air power had sunk a battleship of such magnitude. Through aerial attack alone, Admiral Kurita, witnessing the destruction of one of Japan's most powerful warships, made the difficult decision to reverse course temporarily and assess his losses. The center force had been bloodied, but not broken, and the determined Japanese admiral knew that the fate of his nation might well depend on reaching Leyte Gulf before dawn, while Admiral Kurita's battered center force licked its wounds in the Sabine Sea. A second Japanese force was approaching the southern entrance to Leyte Gulf. Through the narrow confines of Suragawa Strait, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura commanded this southern force. From the bridge of the battleship Yamashiro, his weathered face reflecting the grim determination of a man who knew he was sailing into a trap. Behind him followed the battleship Fuso, heavy cruiser Mogami, and for destroyers, their crews preparing for what would become the last battleship versus battleship engagement in naval history. Waiting in the darkness at the northern end of Suragawa Strait, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had positioned his 6 old battleships in a classic battle line formation that naval strategists had dreamed about since the days of Lord Nelson. The USS West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania sat silent and deadly in the calm waters, their massive 14 and 16-inch guns loaded and trained toward the southern approaches. These were the veterans of Pearl Harbor, raised from the mud and rebuilt for vengeance. The tactical situation was perfect for Oldendorf's forces. The narrow strait would funnel the Japanese ships into a killing zone where American destroyers could launch torpedo attacks from concealment, while the battleships would cross the T of the enemy formation, bringing all their guns to bear, while the Japanese could only respond with their forward turrets. It was a textbook example of naval tactics, but one that required perfect timing and coordination in the pitch-black darkness of a tropical night. At 11:30 on the night of October 24th, American PT boats made first contact with Nishimura's force. As it entered the southern mouth of Suragawa Strait, Lieutenant Commander Robert Leeson's PT-49 to fire the first torpedoes of the engagement. Though the small patrol boats' attacks caused minimal damage to the heavily armored Japanese warships, but their radio reports gave Oldendorf precise information about enemy speed, course, and composition. The destroyer attacks began at 3 o'clock in the morning of October 25th, as Captain Jesse Coward led 9 American destroyers in a coordinated torpedo assault against the Japanese battle line. The destroyers McDermott, Monson, and Remy launched 27 torpedoes in the first wave, their high-speed runs taking them dangerously close to the enemy formation before they turned and raced for safety under cover of smoke screens. The results were devastating for Nishimura's force. The battleship Fuso took multiple torpedo hits amidships and broke apart in a tremendous explosion that lit up the entire strait. The destroyer Michishio simply disappeared in a column of flame and smoke, while Asagumo and Yamagumo suffered severe damage that left them dead in the water. Within 15 minutes, the Japanese Southern Force had been reduced to Yamashiro, Mogami, and the destroyer Shigeru. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison later wrote in his comprehensive 15-volume History of U.S. Naval Operations in World War II that the Battle of Surigao Strait represented the perfect execution of classic naval battle line tactics. Admiral Nishimura, his flagship severely damaged and his force decimated, pressed forward with the desperate courage that characterized Japanese naval leadership throughout the war. At 3:51 in the morning, Yamashiro emerged from the smoke and chaos to face Oldendorf's waiting battle line. The American battleships opened fire simultaneously, their massive guns creating a thunderous barrage that echoed across the water, like the wrath of gods. The one-sided engagement lasted only 18 minutes. Yamashiro, caught in the crossfire of 6 American battleships and numerous cruisers, absorbed hit after hit from 14 and 16-inch shells that penetrated her armor and set her ablaze from stem to stern. Admiral Nishimura went down with his ship. His body never recovered from the dark waters of Surigao Strait. Only the cruiser Mogami and destroyer Shigeru escaped the carnage, limping southward with severe damage as American forces celebrated their complete victory. The Southern force had been annihilated, without inflicting significant casualties on Oldendorf's fleet, and the southern approach to Leyte Gulf was now firmly under American control. But even as the guns fell silent in Surigao Strait, Admiral Kurita's center force was already approaching San Bernardino Strait from the north, and the largest phase of the battle was yet to come. As dawn broke over the Philippine Sea on October 25, 1944, Admiral William Bull Halsey faced the most critical decision of his naval career. Intelligence reports indicated that a powerful Japanese carrier force was approaching from the north, while Admiral Kurita's battered but still dangerous center force was somewhere in the darkness near San Bernardino Strait. The aggressive American commander, his reputation built on bold offensive actions, made a choice that would spark controversy for decades to come. At 2:35 in the morning, Halsey issued the fateful order that would define the Battle of Leyte Gulf's most dramatic phase. Task Force 34, consisting of his 6 fastest battleships and supporting cruisers and destroyers, would join with Task Force 38's carriers in a high-speed pursuit of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force. The Japanese carriers, Halsey reasoned, represented the greatest threat to American operations in the Philippines and had to be destroyed before they could launch their aircraft. Unknown to Halsey, Ozawa's force was exactly what it appeared to be, a deliberately weakened decoy designed to lure the Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf. The Japanese carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda carried fewer than 100 aircraft between them, most of their experienced pilots having been lost in the recent Battle of the Philippine Sea. Ozawa's mission was not to win a victory, but to sacrifice his ships, to give Admiral Kurita's center force a clear path to the American invasion beaches. The morning reconnaissance flights from USS Lexington confirmed Halsey's worst fears and greatest hopes simultaneously. The Japanese carrier force was indeed powerful, apparently including multiple fleet carriers and supporting battleships steaming at high speed toward the American forces. What the reconnaissance pilots could not determine was that most of Ozawa's aircraft had already been transferred to land bases in the Philippines, leaving his carriers as expensive and vulnerable targets. At dawn on October 25th, Admiral Kurita's center force emerged from San Bernardino Strait to find the seas before them completely empty of American heavy units. The trap had worked perfectly, and the Japanese admiral could hardly believe his good fortune. His remaining 4 battleships, including the mighty Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, and numerous destroyers, now had a clear path to Leyte Gulf, and the vulnerable American transports anchored there. Standing directly in Kurita's path was Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's task unit, 7-7.4.3, known by the call sign Taffy 3. Sprague commanded 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, ships designed for anti-submarine warfare and close air support, not fleet engagements with battleships. The disparity in firepower was so enormous that it seemed impossible for the Americans to survive the coming encounter. War correspondent William Manchester, writing for Life magazine, would later describe the morning of October 25th as the moment when David faced Goliath on the high seas, armed only with slingshots and extraordinary courage. At 6:45 in the morning, lookouts aboard USS Fanshawe Bay spotted the distinctive pagoda mass of Japanese battleships emerging from the morning haze. Admiral Sprague immediately ordered his task unit to turn east at maximum speed, while launching every available aircraft. But his escort carriers could manage only 17 knots against the 30-knot speed of Kurita's heavy units. The chase was on, and it appeared that the Japanese had finally achieved their goal of catching American forces. In the open sea, the Japanese opened fire at 7:01, their massive shells sending up powering waterspouts around the fleeing American carriers. The escort carrier Kalinin Bay took the first hit, a 14-inch shell from the heavy cruiser Haguro that penetrated her flight deck. It started serious fires below. But instead of fleeing in panic, Admiral Sprague made a decision that would inspire naval historians for generations to come. "Small boys attack," Sprague ordered, sending his 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts in a suicidal charge against the Japanese battle line. It was a move so audacious and desperate that it caught the enemy completely off guard. USS Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, led the attack with her 5-inch guns blazing against battleships that outweighed her by a factor of 10-1. The destroyer Hull and destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts followed Johnston into the inferno, their crews knowing that they were trading their lives for time to allow the carriers to escape. The small American warships twisted and turned among the Japanese giants, firing their guns and launching torpedoes at point-blank range while heavy shells exploded all around them. As the morning progressed and the desperate running battle continued, Admiral Halsey's carriers were launching massive air strikes against Ozawa's decoy force 300 miles to the north, unaware that the real crisis was developing in the waters off Samar Island. The morning sun climbed higher over the Philippine Sea as one of the most extraordinary David versus Goliath encounters in naval history reached its climax off Samar Island. Admiral Kurita's center force, led by the super battleship Yamato with her 18-inch guns, had caught Admiral Sprague's Taffy 3 in what should have been a massacre. Instead, the desperate American defense was achieving something that seemed impossible. They were actually stopping the Japanese advance through sheer audacity and sacrifice. The destroyer had already absorbed hits for 14-inch shells that would have sunk most ships, but Evans kept his vessel in action, using smoke screens and radical maneuvering to confuse the Japanese gunners. His 5-inch guns, pitifully small against battleship armor, nevertheless scored hit after hit on Japanese bridges and fire control systems. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, had already fired over 600 rounds from her single 5-inch gun when she launched a desperate torpedo attack against the heavy cruiser Chikuma. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland's ship, designed for anti-submarine warfare, was now trading salvos with one of Japan's most powerful cruisers at ranges where the crews could see each other's faces. At 8:20 in the morning, Johnston's incredible fight finally came to an end. A salvo of 6-inch shells from the light cruiser Yahagi struck her engine room, and the destroyer began to lose way. Lieutenant Commander Evans, wounded and bleeding, ordered his crew to abandon ship as Japanese vessels closed in for the kill. As Johnston rolled over and sank, survivors in the water reported seeing Japanese sailors on nearby destroyers standing at attention and saluting in recognition of their enemy's extraordinary courage. The escort carriers, meanwhile, were launching every aircraft they could get into the air, regardless of whether the planes were armed for anti-ship attacks. Torpedo bombers without torpedoes made dummy runs to distract Japanese gunners, while fighters strafed battleship bridges with their machine guns in attacks that were more psychological than physical. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable led a group of FM to Wildcat fighters in repeated strafing attacks against Yamato's superstructure, their 50 caliber bullets harmless against the battleship's armor, but effective in forcing her anti-aircraft gunners to take cover. According to declassified after-action reports from the Naval Historical Center, Admiral Sprague later admitted that he had expected his entire task unit to be annihilated within 30 minutes of first contact with the Japanese fleet. The most astonishing moment of the entire battle came at 9:20-5 in the morning, when Admiral Kurita suddenly ordered his entire force to break off the attack and withdraw toward San Bernardino Strait. The Japanese admiral, confused by the fierce American resistance and convinced that he was facing fleet carriers rather than the smaller escort carriers, believed that Halsey's main force was approaching and that his ships were in danger of being trapped. The decision to withdraw remains one of the most controversial in naval history. Kurita's center force was on the verge of achieving complete victory, with the American carriers nearly out of ammunition and fuel. Gambier Bay had already been sunk by concentrated fire from Japanese cruisers, and several other carriers were badly damaged. The road to Leyte Gulf lay open, and the destruction of MacArthur's invasion transports would have dealt a devastating blow to American Pacific operations. But Kurita had been operating under tremendous stress for 4 days, having lost his flagship, seen the mighty Musashi sunk by air attacks, and now faced what appeared to be a major fleet engagement against superior forces. The admiral's caution, while understandable from his perspective, robbed Japan of its last real opportunity to achieve a strategic victory in the Pacific War. As the Japanese ships disappeared over the horizon, Admiral Sprague's surviving vessels began the grim task of rescuing survivors from the water. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts had fought until her ammunition was exhausted and her hull split open by enemy fire. The destroyer hull had gone down fighting, her crew maintaining fire control until the very end. Of the original 18 ships in Taffy 3 had been sunk and most of the others bore severe battle damage. The miracle off Samar had cost the lives of over 1,000 American sailors, but their sacrifice had achieved the impossible. A handful of escort carriers and destroyers had turned back the most powerful naval force. Japan could still put to sea, saving MacArthur's invasion from potential disaster. Far to the north of the desperate struggle off Samar Island, Admiral William Bull Halsey's massive Task Force 38 was closing in for the kill against Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force off Cape Ingawo. The Japanese decoy mission had succeeded beyond Ozawa's wildest expectations, drawing away the entire American covering force and giving Admiral Kurita a clear path to Leyte Gulf. Now, however, the price of that success was about to be paid in full as over 1,000 American aircraft prepared to deliver the coup de grace to the Imperial Navy's remaining carriers. The first airstrike launched at dawn on October 25th, with 180 aircraft from USS Intrepid, USS Franklin, USS Lexington, and USS Enterprise climbing into the clear morning sky. Commander David McCampbell, already the Navy's leading ace with 27 confirmed kills, led the fighter escort as the massive formation winged northward toward their target. Below them, Ozawa's four carriers steamed in perfect formation, their flight decks empty of aircraft, but their anti-aircraft guns manned and ready. The Japanese force made a magnificent sight in the morning light. The fleet carrier Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the only survivor of the 6 carriers that had launched that infamous attack, led the formation with her distinctive curved flight deck gleaming in the sun. Behind her followed the light carriers Weiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda, surrounded by their escorts of cruisers and destroyers. T was the last operational carrier force the Imperial Navy possessed, and Ozawa knew that none of his ships would survive the day. The air battle that followed was completely one-sided, as the Japanese had fewer than 30 aircraft available to defend their fleet. American Hellcats and Corsairs swept the skies clean in less than 15 minutes, shooting down every Zero that rose to meet them while losing only to fighters in return. With Japanese air cover eliminated, the dive bombers and torpedo planes pressed home their attacks against the helpless carriers below. Zuikaku, the pride of the Japanese fleet and the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force, became the primary target of the American assault. The veteran Flat-Top's anti-aircraft guns put up a fierce barrage, but she was overwhelmed by the sheer number of attacking aircraft. Lieutenant Commander James Minnie led 12 Helldiver dive bombers from USS Enterprise in a devastating attack that scored 7 direct hits on the carrier's flight deck, starting massive fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. Contemporary accounts from Admiral Ozawa's staff, preserved in post-war interrogations, describe the American air attacks as a perfectly coordinated symphony of destruction that left no hope for survival. By 10:30 in the morning, Zuikaku was listing heavily to port and settling by the bow as her crew fought desperately to save their ship. Captain Toshiyuki Yokoi ordered the battle flag nailed to the mast in a final gesture of defiance, then went down with his ship when she rolled over and sank at 11:45. With her went the last link to Japan's early victories in the Pacific War and the dreams of naval supremacy that had driven the empire into conflict with America. The light carriers Chitos and Chiyoda followed their flagship to the bottom. Within the next 2 hours, their smaller hulls unable to absorb the punishment that had been required to sink Zuikaku. Only Zuiho managed to survive the morning air strikes. though she was so badly damaged that she could barely maintain steerage way. Admiral Ozawa transferred his flag to the light cruiser Oyoto and continued to withdraw northward, hoping to save at least some of his remaining ships. The destroyers Akitsuki and Hatsuzuki were also sunk in the continued attacks, leaving Ozawa with only 2 cruisers and a handful of destroyers from his original force. The decoy mission had been accomplished, but at the cost of Japan's entire remaining carrier aviation capability. As the sun set on October 25th, Admiral Halsey finally received urgent messages from Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Kincaid demanding to know where Task Force 34 had gone. The famous message, "Where's Task Force 34, the world wonders," sent Halsey into a rage, as he realized that his pursuit of the Japanese carriers had left 7th Fleet to face the crisis. Off Samar Island alone, Halsey immediately ordered his fastest battleships south at maximum speed, but it was already too late to affect the outcome off Samar. Admiral Kurita's center force was already withdrawing through San Bernardino Strait, having missed its opportunity to strike at the invasion beaches. His great gamble had failed, and with it died Japan's last hope of achieving a decisive naval victory in the Pacific War. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was effectively over, though scattered actions would continue for several more days, and for days of fighting across an area larger than the entire continental United States. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a crushing defeat from which it would never recover. The gray dawn of October 26, 1944, revealed the full scope of the catastrophe that had befallen the Imperial Japanese Navy in the waters around the Philippine Islands, across thousands of square miles of ocean. The debris of Japan's once mighty fleet floated on the gentle swells, life rafts filled with survivors, oil slicks that stretched to the horizon, and the scattered wreckage of ships that had carried the hopes and dreams of an empire into their final battle. Admiral Soamu Toyoda's headquarters in Tokyo received the first fragmentary reports of the disaster. Throughout the early morning hours, each message bringing news of further losses that seemed impossible to believe. The super battleship Musashi, pride of the fleet and symbol of Japanese naval power, had been sunk by American air attacks in the Sabine Sea. The southern force under Admiral Nishimura had been virtually annihilated in Surigao Strait, with both battleships and most escorts sent to the bottom. The entire mobile fleet's remaining carriers had been destroyed off Cape Ingao, eliminating Japan's last hope of conducting effective carrier operations. Most shocking of all was the news from Admiral Kurita's center force, which had achieved complete tactical surprise off Samar Island, only to withdraw at the moment of victory. The opportunity to destroy MacArthur's invasion transports and potentially change the course of the Pacific War had been abandoned in confusion and uncertainty. Kurita's decision to retreat would haunt Japanese naval strategists for the remainder of the war and beyond. The human cost of the Battle of Leyte Gulf was staggering for both sides, but fell disproportionately on the Japanese. Over 10,000 officers and men of the Imperial Navy had perished in 4 days of fighting, including some of Japan's most experienced ship commanders and naval aviators. The loss of institutional knowledge and combat experience was irreplaceable, as the Empire's naval academies could no longer produce trained personnel at anywhere near the rate. They were being lost in battle. American casualties, while significant, were far lighter than the Japanese losses. The heroic actions off Samar Island had cost over 1,000 lives, mostly from the crews of USS Johnston, USS Hull, USS Samuel B. Roberts, and USS Gambier Bay. These men had died buying time for their comrades and proving that courage and determination could sometimes overcome overwhelming material disadvantage. Their sacrifice would be remembered as one of the finest hours in United States naval history. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that the Battle of Leyte Gulf effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct major naval operations, leaving the home islands completely dependent on land-based air power for defense. The strategic implications of the American victory were immediately apparent to military planners on both sides of the Pacific. With the Imperial Navy's offensive capability eliminated, Japan's outer defensive perimeter had collapsed completely. The Philippines would inevitably fall to MacArthur's advancing forces, cutting off Japanese garrisons throughout the Southwest Pacific and severing vital shipping routes. To the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, Emperor Hirohito, receiving detailed reports of the naval disaster from his military advisors, began to privately question whether Japan could continue the war much longer. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers in a single engagement represented a blow from which the Imperial Navy could never recover. American shipyards were launching new vessels at a rate that made replacement of Japanese losses impossible, even if the empire's industrial capacity had not been steadily degraded by strategic bombing. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the battle reports from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, recognized that the victory at Leyte Gulf had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific. American naval forces could now operate with virtual impunity throughout Japanese-controlled waters, supporting amphibious landings wherever strategic requirements dictated. The road to the Japanese home islands lay open, guarded only by land-based aircraft and the desperate courage of a nation facing inevitable defeat. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had lasted for days and covered an area of ocean larger than the entire continental United States. Over 200 ships and nearly 2,000 aircraft had participated in what would forever remain the largest naval engagement in human history. When the guns finally fell silent and the last aircraft returned to their carriers, the outcome of the Pacific War had been decided. Japan's naval empire was finished, and the Rising Sun flag would never again challenge American dominance on the world's largest ocean. In the months that followed, surviving Japanese naval units would be hunted down and destroyed piecemeal as American forces advanced inexorably toward the home islands. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had not only crushed Japan's last hope of naval victory, but had also demonstrated the complete superiority of American industrial capacity, tactical doctrine, and fighting spirit. The empire that had begun the war with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor now faced the bitter reality of total defeat, its naval forces reduced to a scattered remnant incapable of meaningful resistance. The largest naval battle in history was over, and with it died the last illusions of Japanese military leaders about their ability to achieve anything other than an honorable surrender. The price of victory had been paid in full, and the Pacific War entered its final, desperate phase as Japan prepared to defend its homeland against the inevitable American invasion.